Hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for Pressboard's first ever webinar. This is Jerrid Grimm. I'm the co-founder of Pressboard, and today we're going to be talking about the science of storytelling. This is going to be fun. We're going to look at how storytelling affects our brains, so get ready to geek out a little bit for the next 20 to 30 minutes. Just want to let you know, if you have any questions at all, go ahead and send them through in the chat box. I'll be answering the questions at the end of the presentation. If we don't have time to get to all of your questions, we'll make sure to send through the answers to those ones afterwards. If you have any technical difficulties at all, you can also send those through in the chat box, and our moderator, Sean, will do his best to help you out. All right, let's get started. So, you may have noticed, but at Pressboard, we love stories, and we all believe that great stories are meant to be shared. In fact, we've committed our entire company's resources on building software to help get a brand's own stories published on places like Fast Company, Refinery 29, Vox, and hundreds of other publications. We've been fortunate to help brands such as Chase, Hilton, and Nordstrom publish over 3,000 stories so far, and our technology measures hundreds of individual data points on each of them. But I'm not here to tell you about Pressboard today. Today, I'm going to share with you the scientific reason why stories can convince people to do the things they thought they'd never do, like buy a hybrid or vote for Trump. And believe it or not, it all has to do with sex, drugs, and rock and roll. But first, here's a quick story of how I got here. I fell in love with marketing when I was a kid. I grew up in the 80s. Nike had just launched their Just Do It campaign. Apple was challenging IBM with their 1984 commercial. And Angela Bauer had just hired Tony Michelli to help her out while she got her own ad agency off the ground on a sitcom called Who's the Boss? Marketing wasn't about chasing clicks or breaching privacy. It was all about telling stories, and it was a hell of a time to be alive and a great time to be in marketing. I actually knew when I was 13 years old that I was going to be a marketer. While all the other kids wanted to be astronauts or doctors or lawyers, I wanted Angela Bauer's job. But a lot has changed since then. People are still watching shows, we're still reading articles, and we're still watching movies like crazy, but the ads don't seem to be working like they used to. You have to kind of wonder, like, why are people willing to pay to subscribe to Netflix just so that they can skip watching commercials? And if they don't have Netflix, they have a DVR, they likely have both. So we're still watching shows and movies like crazy, but we're finding new ways to be able to avoid the ads that are placed within them. And you also think about articles. We read more articles and watch more news videos than we ever have before. And yet, a recent study that we did showed that 38% of people have downloaded an ad blocker. So again, we're interested in reading the articles and watching videos, but we're doing everything that we can to avoid the advertising, which often supports this. And then even further to that point, we're willing to pay 20 bucks to go to a theater to watch what is essentially a 2-hour animated Lego catalog. So content is bigger than ever. It's just the advertising model that's been supporting it seems to be breaking down. So we started asking ourselves these same questions at Pressboard. The makeup of our team, half of our team is made up of content experts, and the other half are software engineers and data scientists. So we tend to dig pretty deep into the data behind behaviors when we want to find out what's going on. And in this case, with our company being built on content, we needed to find out the scientific reason on why human beings are still so in love with stories, but increasingly turned off by ads. And so let's get started. Part of the reason, as I mentioned, has to do with sex and drugs, and it may not be in exactly the way that you're thinking of it. So take a moment and think about your favorite movie. And then think about the hero of that story. Have you ever wondered why you care about fictional characters so much? Why is it that we pull for Saving Private Ryan? Why do we care if he gets saved? What happens to Forrest Gump, or even whether the Barton Bellas will win the National A Cappella Championships? The reason we care about these often fictional characters is because our brains are wired to do so. It's actually entirely out of our conscious control. You see, when you read a dry, fact-based textbook, or you come across an advertisement, there are two areas of your brain that are activated. These are called the language processing centers. But what happens when you hear a story is that a whole bunch of other areas of your brain are engaged as well. So for example, when you hear the gunshots in Saving Private Ryan, your sensory cortex is engaged. When Forrest Gump starts to run, your motor cortex is activated. And even when I was telling you the story about my own childhood marketing influences, your hippocampus brought up your own memories automatically so that you could compare them against mine. Stories actually engage our entire brain, which is why we remember them, and yet we'll forget 99.99% of every ad we've ever seen. And there's something even more interesting, is when you hear an emotional story, something powerful happens. Our brains release a hormone called oxytocin. And oxytocin is a hell of a drug. Oxytocin is only released in humans in a few situations. One is in childbirth, another is in milk letdown among women, and the last one is during sex. So in those 3 times, oxytocin is released, and the only other way it's released is when we hear an emotional story. And in humans, oxytocin is called the love hormone, and it helps humans recognize, trust, and bond with one another. And that's actually why you fall in love with the hero of the story. And it isn't just the hero of the story we fall in love with. The halo effect creates a bond with all supporting characters as well. Because once oxytocin is released in our brain, it automatically creates this sense of empathy and trust and bonding with everything that we're interacting with. It's even been shown that stories can influence our actions. They can make us make choices and change our behavior in ways that reflect the story we've just heard. It's the same phenomenon why we are so engaged in political campaigns. If political movements were a movie, the leader of your chosen party becomes the hero of that story, and the opposing leader is therefore the villain. We vote highly based on emotional factors, including our affinity for that leader or the hero of the story and their own personal story. See, if we just relied purely on rational facts and data, we wouldn't even have the need for drawn up political campaigns or rallies. Campaign ads and mudslinging would be completely unnecessary. All we'd have to do is read through a document that summarized the position of each party and make a rational decision on which one best aligned with us. But in reality, we need that story in order to create an emotional connection enough to care to vote. It's pretty interesting, right? But you might say, we're not making movies here or running for president. So what does this have to do with marketing? And so anytime that we take a theory like this, we want to put it to the test. So I'm going to talk through a few ways that this theory has been tested around how our brains are wired for storytelling. The first one was a study that we came across that was done a few years ago by Dr. Paul Zak, who's a neuroeconomist. Paul and his team wanted to find out if telling a story through a narrative would be able to, through a father's eyes, so there was 2 versions of a story that were created. The story was about the father and his son, and the son was diagnosed with terminal cancer. And the first video was told through this narrative through the father's eyes. It talked about how he was having trouble playing with his son even because he knew his son had terminal cancer and was going to die, so he wasn't able to spend that time with him without being really hurt in those moments. It did continue to tell the story of, he told the story of how he was able to overcome this and be able to spend those last few weeks caring with his son, and how it led to this really positive closure. Then the story was told in a non-narrative form. All the facts were listed, the name of the father, who the son was, what cancer was he had, the timeline, but it was presented purely in facts. Now, in order to see if that story narrative made any difference, a number of people were split into 2 groups. One group watched the story told through the father's eyes in a narrative form, and the other group received the dry explanation. Each person was then given $10 for their time and had the option of donating a portion of their money to a cancer charity. And what was really interesting was the group that watched the story version told through a narrative almost all donated their money to the cause immediately. And on the other hand, none of the people that read the fact-based version did. Although both groups were presented with the exact same information, the story changed the behavior of the people. Now, again, we're not all dealing with something as deeply emotional as, children with terminal cancer or that type of story. Some of us are just trying to open up bank accounts or sell cars. So does our brain react in the same way when a commercial brand is involved? So to take a look at this, we wanted to go inside people's brains. Toyota had recently run a few Prius branded videos for their hybrid Prius, with some local publishers that they had found through Pressboard's marketplace. The business objective of this branded content was to show Toyota Prius's insane fuel economy. In the past, Toyota was finding that no one really cared about the miles per gallon stats in their traditional advertising, even though it was exceptional. So for one of the branded videos, we decided to recruit a real life couple and challenge them to take a road trip and drive the Prius until it ran out of gas. The video, instead of being focused on the miles per gallon stats or the feature set of the car, the video would focus on the story of this couple, and the Prius would just play a supporting role. At the beginning of the video, we meet the couple, and they're obviously quite in love. They're giggling, they're excited, they're in the honeymoon phase of their relationship, and they're ready to take on this challenge together. But as the road trip gets longer and longer, you can see this relationship starting to break down. And anyone who's been on a long road trip knows that spending several hours in a car with anyone can be a test. So as they're driving around on this infinite loop to see when they'll run out of fuel, at about the 7-hour mark, the girlfriend threatens to break up with her boyfriend. And at that point, they've only gone through a tiny fraction of the fuel. Finally, 12 hours in, and at their wits' end, the boyfriend pulls the car over and they surrender the challenge, but he likely saves the relationship at the same time. Then the camera pans over to the fuel gauge and we see that the Prius has only burned through 1/8 of the tank of gas. Now, our technology is looking at how many people are sharing this, how long they're spending with the video, and we're looking at all of these 3 different videos that were created. This was the one that had the biggest storyline in it. And this video of the couple was by far the most shared on social media. The average watching time was through the roof, but really there was no way to tell beyond that it was popular, whether it was effective or not, or why people were so interested in it. So in order to do that, we've partnered up with a company called Brain Sights, which is based in Toronto. And what you see in this image is a brain scanner. And this actually can measure the frequency of someone's brain activity. Now, when we took a look, we understand that certain brain frequencies mean different things in people. And if we're measuring brain frequencies, we can see whether the frequencies are alluding to that the viewer is paying attention, or if they're making an emotional connection. And there's even other brain frequencies that can tell us if they're encoding it to their memory. So we measured the brain activity of over 100 people as they watched the Toyota video. And not only did we get them to watch this Toyota video, but we wanted to see how their brain frequencies changed when they watched shows like This Is Us, or if they were watching NFL highlights. And the reason was because branded content should not be held to the same level as traditional advertising. If it's supposed to be about storytelling, we need to keep it adhered to the same level as some of the best entertainment out there, because that's what it's competing against. So when we took a look at this Toyota video, as people were watching it, we noticed a few things. There was spikes of brain activity when the couple was introduced and as their relationship ran into conflicts. But when the camera panned to the Toyota fuel gauge, we also saw that those moments were being directly encoded into audience's memory. In fact, the brainwave activity in the Toyota branded video was comparable to the frequencies seen when the audience was exposed to TV shows like This Is Us and NFL highlights. And the reason is that our brain works very similar with all types of stories. We introduce the characters early on, we create an emotional connection with them, they run into conflict, and all of this creates what we talked about earlier, which is releasing oxytocin in the brain, engaging different parts, and we see those brain frequencies light up when we're measuring them through that brain scanner device. So even though Toyota wasn't the hero of the story, they played an important role as a supporting character to the plot. By incorporating their marketing objective into the story, they made it memorable in a way that the fuel economy stat never would. And if you think about it, Toyota plays a very important role in this story. If it was just a couple driving a car, maybe they wouldn't have run into that conflict. And the conflict was caused because this vehicle was going to be driving for so long. We're at 7 hours, then 12 hours. And so Prius played a supporting role in this. And when we pan down to the gauge, it's a part of that story and it supports that story. So it begs the question, when is the right time to bring in your brand? In the example that we just talked about with Toyota, the brand was brought in later in the story and was used as a supporting character. So in order to understand this better, we studied over 300 brand stories from all industries across dozens of different publications. For this one, we looked at them in article format, so text and images. We tracked each of these stories with our software on a number of different measurement criteria, including how active people were while reading them, how far they scrolled through the story, whether they were shared or not. We looked at how early and how often a brand was mentioned in each article. And the reason that we did this is I think all of us in content marketing have this understanding that if you turn something from an interesting story into something that's very advertorial, we're likely going to lose people. No one likes a sales pitch. So we wanted to understand if the stats actually supported that gut feel that we had. And what we found out was really interesting. It actually turns out that you can bring in the brand mention, but you just can't do it too early or too often. When we looked at all of these stories, we identified when the brand was mentioned, and we compared it to if the brand wasn't mentioned at all. So we take a look at stories where the brand isn't mentioned, and we can see that they have a really good level of engagement. And then we look at if the brand was brought in very early into the story, and remember, this is outside of disclosure. Disclosure is always important, saying who the brand is that's presenting the story, but we mean in the actual story itself, in the article. If it was brought up in the first 100 words, engagement dropped dramatically. Basically, people weren't spending as much time with it. They were checking out really early on. But if the brand was brought in after the first 100 words, there was no negative effect on the engagement. People were introduced to the premise of the story, and the brand was brought in as a supporting character, and engagement was able to hold on long. And the further along the story that the brand was brought in, the higher the engagement was. And if you look, the difference between having no brand mentioned and having the brand mentioned later in the story are equal or more positive if the brand is brought in later on. So that was one thing that we found that was really interesting. The other part that we wanted to find out was around occurrence. So yes, we should bring in the brand a little bit later in the story, bring them in as a supporting character, but how many times should we mention the brand? So when we looked at these articles, we noticed a similar type of pattern. We compared it to when the brand wasn't mentioned at all. Now, if the brand was only mentioned once, we actually saw an increase in the engagement with the story. And this can be similar to that Toyota Prius example, is that the brand makes the story more valuable. Now, if the brand is brought up over and over again, meaning the company name here, we did see declining results. So there's negative effect if you bring the brand into the story early and often. And I think that just leads to this idea that if you turn a story into an advertorial, you're quickly going to lose the audience's interest. I just want to pause for a second and remind everyone, if you have any questions at all, you can put them in the chat box, and I'll be able to answer those at the end of the presentation. And if we don't get to all of your questions, we'll make sure to follow up with a Q&A that'll be emailed out to everyone afterwards. So we talked about how our brain with storytelling is similar to sex and drugs and how it applies to oxytocin and as well as engage in different parts. Now, when we talk about rock and roll, think of it this way. Every band of musicians play different roles. You have a charismatic lead singer, you have a brooding bass guitarist, and you can have a crazy eccentric on the drums. But it's the combination of these musicians and instruments that give a band its synergy and turn into creating beautiful music. When you're thinking about how your brand should be incorporated into a story, think of it this way. Your brand doesn't need to be the Mick Jagger of the story, but it can be a hell of a Keith Richards. It's important to let the story shine first, bring your characters in early on, and create an emotional connection, and then bring your brand in so that it makes the story better instead of taking away from it. So let's recap. What we've learned so far is that the science of storytelling, content isn't a fad. The science tells us that stories can change our behavior. In fact, our brains are wired for stories. Stories engage parts of our brain and release hormones that ads never will. If you use your brand strategically and sparingly, you can actually increase engagement among your audience. And next time someone asks you what your job is, just let them know you tell stories and it's basically just a lot of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. So that's going to be the portion of our story of our webinar where we talk a little bit about the science. Now, I'm going to field a few questions right now. So let's get started with that. Sean's going to pop up a few questions here. Okay, here's a good one. So our first question is, how do I convince my client to resist peppering the story with their brand name mentions if your data shows that it has a negative effect on time spent and engagement? Is it enough to be able to say that to convince, and I'm assuming this is someone that works at an agency or is a consultant and has a brand as a client? That's a really good question. So we built this idea around the reason that we did all of these studies was for this exact reason. So we all have this, we have this knowledge that if we turn this into an advertorial, nobody's going to pay attention. But we're talking primarily about paid content, which means the brand does have the right to put their brand wherever they want to. They pay for the space and they can do what they want with it. But the data shows, even beyond engagement, I think there's this little secret that we have that we've been finding out, which is a really strong argument on why you should create interesting stories. And it actually has to do with budget. So sure, you can go in, you can talk to your clients and say, hey, Pressboard has all this data. It says that if we bring the brand up as a supporting character, we mention less option, people are going to spend more time with the story. But there's something else that goes into play too. Almost every story, whether it's an article or a video, needs to be promoted on the internet in order to get that first batch of people to pay attention to it. And in order to do that, it's usually done in a few ways, but primarily you're using Facebook ads and you're buying native ads and you're using Twitter ads to be able to promote that story. Now that costs money. So you're buying ad units that are promoting the headline and the image, and then people are opening up that story and then they're reading it. It's actually significantly cheaper to promote a good story, an interesting story, one with a narrative, than it is to promote an advertorial. Sometimes it's up to 5 times cheaper to promote a story that is interesting than it is to promote an advertorial. So if you think of it just as a pure economics perspective, doing an interesting story is cheaper than doing a heavily brand mentioned story. So next time I guess your client says, hey, we noticed you just brought the brand up halfway through the story and they've only been mentioned a couple times, you can say, yes, we can add it several more times, but you're going to have to increase your budget about 5 times. So that's one. We like to look at it more from the data and analytics standpoint, because it's really hard to take your bias out of what a good story is or not. But if you look at the stats, you can get higher engagement and you can promote the story for cheaper if it's interesting and it doesn't become advertorial. So I hope that answers that question. We have a second question here. In your experience, are certain products or industries better suited for storytelling? That's a good question. So when we started the company, most of our clients fell into tourism destinations, beer companies, and telco companies. And I think the reason was those are very content-rich industries. If you think of tourism destinations, everybody loves reading a story about places to visit, itineraries to follow, maybe a local eatery that is new to discover, and there's all these interesting stories around travel. People love to travel, and even personal stories of experiences. When you think of beer companies, a lot of times they're promoting lifestyle. So going out, how can you spend more time with friends? How can you see more musicians? How can you see behind the scenes? Again, very content rich. And so a lot of the stories that we were seeing early on, and I think a lot of the earliest content marketers, you take a look at someone like Red Bull, which is focused on entertainment and is one of the gold standards of content marketing. Those were the people that were early to this space. They were early to storytelling because the stories were easy to tell. But in more recent years, in the last couple of years, we're seeing a lot more attention to content marketing in more, let's call them undifferentiated areas, industries. For example, banking. Banking is one of the most undifferentiated industries because mortgage rates and interest rates are set. So there's very little variation. A checking account is very similar between one bank and another bank. So when you're promoting something like a no-fee checking account or a 3.7% mortgage rate, every bank does it in a very similar way. And so the only way to differentiate themselves to their consumers is by having an interesting story to tell. And we've seen this recently. One of our clients, which is TD, was really had this, checking account, which was well suited for new immigrants. It was easy to set up. It didn't require all of the documentation that would be required. It had very low fees. It was easy to use. But that on its own wasn't that interesting. And so what they did was they started just being helpful. So they created these stories that were helpful to people that were new to Canada. And whether it was a story on Parents Canada about how to help your kid meet new friends in a new country, or whether it was a task list of things that you need to do within your first 6 months of arriving, rather than talking about the features and benefits of a bank account, instead they just became helpful and told stories that were helpful to that exact consumer. So right around this idea of being more audience centric. And I think that we're seeing more and more content marketing being applied effectively to undifferentiated industries like that. All right, we've got a few more questions in here. We may go a little bit over time, but I do want to get to a couple of these ones and then we'll follow up later. So if my brand is new to storytelling, where should I start? This is a great question. Even when Pressboard, when we started our blog, you kind of wonder, you may not be credible in a space yet. We may not have done all this research yet on the side of storytelling. So instead, we just told personal stories. And initially it was just me and TM, my business partner that had started the company. So we just told stories about what was going on in starting a company. When I started the company with TM, I had just had a baby. We just bought a new house in North Vancouver. I quit my job. I did it all in 1 month. And so there was this, you can imagine that there was this very dramatic time in my life. And so I would just write blog posts about that, about the challenges of starting a new business, having a new kid, wife on mat leave, us having no income, and the challenges that were involved with it. And I think that resonated because it was just a true story of how we were starting it up. TM talked a lot about the stress that happens within the developer community when you're starting something out. You spend a lot of time, just you and the computer and the code, not interacting with a lot of people, and that can lead to like trying emotional because you're not interacting with people. So we told those stories first. Now at a larger company, what I find is the best place to start is that companies are started for a reason. Brands are started for a reason. There's a founder story, or there's a problem that you were trying to solve at the beginning. And I think that's an important, we see beer companies doing this well. They go back to, they were started during Prohibition, because that's an interesting story. And I think bringing out that founder story, or the reason why your company exists, is a great place to start. And that should be your first blog post if you don't have any yet. Another way is simply just going to your frequently asked questions that come in to either your sales team or customer service team. If you're getting asked a lot of questions, you probably can answer those questions easily through an article and do it in an interesting way that tells a little bit more of a personal side of that, about how that customer is dealing with a problem and how you can help solve that. And those are some very low-hanging fruit as far as content goes. So I think that's a good place to start. Tell about the why your company exists, what problem they're solving, and look at questions that are being asked of you. Now I'm going to do another question here. Let's see. What metric do you use as a proof of impact? For instance, time spent could be high, but if the brand is only mentioned once, where's the guarantee that the investment was worth it? Yeah, so this is going to sound like a cop-out answer, but it depends on what your objectives are. So if you think of trying to gain awareness with a consumer base, so maybe people don't know your brand that well, then really what you're looking for is to occupy a little bit of space in their brain for a period of time. We only have one thing really that we have a cap on, and that's our time. And for as long as marketing has been around, the job of marketing is to occupy a little bit of that time during the day. So if it's a TV ad, we're trying to get 30 seconds from them to pay attention to us. If it's an article, maybe we're getting them to try spend a little bit more time. If it's a banner ad, we're trying to get a click. So if your job is to create awareness, then I think the most important thing to look at is how much time people are spending with you. If they're not spending time with you, you're not occupying any of their finite resource, which is time. Now, if you're looking at something more lower funnel, like acquisition, then what you want to do is just be able to attribute what impact that story made on someone. And this isn't perfect, because someone might read a story on the New York Times, and then 6 weeks later they may decide to purchase that product in store, and there's no connection between those two things. So if you're looking at lower funnel, look at signals that prove that this audience is more interested than other audiences that are coming to you. And for example, a lot of ways that they'll do it is because we can track who's reading a story, how long they're reading it for, and the next action they take. We can see if people were spending time with a certain story on, let's say, Fast Company, and then we can see if that person went later to the brand website and how much time they then spent on the brand website. So we've done this a lot at Pressboard, is we may do some stories on LinkedIn, or we may do it on Digiday, and then we can see when those people, after they've read that story, do they come to our website and do they bounce right away? Or do they come and do they look around? Do they visit other blog posts? Do they maybe sign up for a Pressboard account? And so just looking at the time spent that those people that read that article spend now on our website, and the difference between that and, let's say, like a search result click, we're able to say that it's a more valuable customer that's coming in from reading that story previously. So the short answer is you're either looking at how much time you're engaging with people if you're upper funnel, or you're looking at the qualification of the people that are later coming to either your website or your store or buying your product in the same way. Now, I think we're all out of time, so I'm going to wrap up there. We've got a few other questions, and I think what we'll do is we'll take all of these questions in, we'll write up some responses, and we'll email them out to everybody afterwards. So I just want to say thank you to everyone who's listening out there and who's watching this webinar. This was our first one that we've ever done. I'd love to get your feedback. Please email me directly. It's Jerrid@pressboardmedia.com. If you have any questions, JERRID @pressboardmedia.com. I'd love to get your feedback, good and bad. We'll be doing these regularly, so I'd love to see what you think. And if you ever have any questions, please reach out to me or anyone on our team. And thanks. I hope you have a great rest of your day.